and saxophone in New Orleans.
And when does this influx of people coming from the Caribbean begin to come to New York?
Well, then you got to go into the 1920s because, especially around 1917 when Puerto Ricans are granted citizenship, then many of them come to New York City, and we also Cubans, etc., travel to New York City, and we get musicians like Ram Ramirez, the great guitarist who's Puerto Riqueño, who is the composer of Lover Man. We get the great Puerto Rican trumpeter Louis King Garcia, who played with Penny Goodsman's orchestra. And then in the 1940s, we get this huge migration of Puerto Riqueños into New York. Many Cubans, especially of Afro-Cuban descent, come to New York City. And the beginning, really, as far as what we call Latin jazz today, specifically Afro-Cuban jazz, 1939, Mario Bauzá, he had already been playing for the last like 9 years.
With other bands here.
Yeah, yes. he playing lead trumpet with Noble Sissel's orchestra, with Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, with Cab Calloway's orchestra, with, I mean, so many people. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then with his brother-in-law,
Machito.
Francisco Raúl Gutiérrez Grillo de Ayala, Machito. They formed this band that is the first band to fuse jazz arranging techniques with
the Afro-Cubans.
Right, with Afro-Cuban rhythm. And it's amazing because people talk to me about civil rights. These guys inadvertently start a civil rights movement in the music business because they were the first and only band, to my knowledge, to use that word Afro in their moniker, Machito and the Afro-Cubans, 1939. This was at a time when African Americans were disassociating themselves with anything from Africa because it was considered tribal, primitive. They wanted to get away from that. And here is this band. All of a sudden you see on the marquee, Machito and his Afro-Cubans. I go, oh, you know, people are walking by, what is this? And of course, the first band to use the triumvirate of conga, bongo, and timbales. I mean, you're talking about a time period where you could not go to any music store in New York and buy a conga. Now you can anywhere. Yeah. That time, the only place you could go to was a bakery on Lenox Avenue and 116th Street called Simon's, who was a baker from Cuba, and he would import drums from Cuba. So, I mean, there you go.
The bakery sold drums?
Yeah, because in the back, they had a big courtyard, and all the musicians were out there, and what they used to do, they used to rumbear and get together. So it was a meeting place for musicians also.
Okay, so all of these musicians are coming from Cuba in the 20s.
And from Puerto Rico too.
And from Puerto Rico and other countries in Latin America.
Yeah, Mexicans, the Dominican Republic. There was a band called the Santo Domingo Serenaders.
So all of these sounds were emerging from all of these countries, plus the jazz contribution of the United States already had. All of this merging together, this fusion of different sounds.
Of course.
Okay, so what does that lead to? Does that lead to what is now known as Latin jazz?
Sure. And now we're in an exciting period because I said before, where the rhythms from other parts of Latin America, we have, 21, 22 countries in Latin America, they're all starting to be represented by young musicians who are from these countries, and they have this rhythmic knowledge from their own country, and they want to exude it in their own workings as jazz musicians. So you have people like Danilo Perez from Panama, great pianist, Luis Perdomo from Venezuela, you know, and Pablo Mayor, who's another pianist from Colombia, who are doing things with their native rhythms and, you know, fusing them with jazz tradition. And of course, ourselves here in New York City, all the ensembles that I've led over the years.
When we listen to Latin, Spanish language radio in New York nowadays, we listen to a lot of salsa, a lot of merengue, a lot of bachata. We do not listen to a lot of Latin jazz. What's happening there? Why?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask. I can't speak for those stations. Those are commercial stations, and of course, you know, they're owned by certain people, and they can do whatever they want. The music, the jazz-oriented Latin music that we're speaking of, it was very much more prevalent in the 70s and 60s on radio, because radio simply reflected the time period. It was a very revolutionary time period, and people were more progressive and more forward-thinking.
But there were also more places to go listen to live jazz than there are now, right?
Exactly. Here in the Bronx, we had the Blue Morocco, the Blue Flame. There are many places here in the Bronx that had jazz. Listen, I can give you an example. I saw a poster from 1955 of The Tito Rodriguez from the Hunts Point Palace. The Tito Rodriguez Orchestra is playing, and who's the opening act? The Thelonious Monk Quartet. This is at the Hunts Point Palace. So, I mean, you don't see these kind of things anymore. And of course, now there's a big disconnect with our youth, because before, at least people of my generation, I just turned 50 years old, even if you weren't into jazz, jazz was around you. It was in the cartoons, the Flintstones, Top Cat, Johnny Quest, or whatever. You saw it on variety shows. You heard it, even if you didn't know it was jazz. The Johnny Carson Tonight Show, the Dick Cavett Show, the David Frost Show, etc. It was on radio. We had several jazz radio stations here in New York City. That's all gone now. So if for a young person today to get into jazz, usually what happens is they get into it because somebody in their family is into it and they expose them to it. Maybe they're lucky enough to be in a music program in the public school system that offers them the opportunity to study, which is another big thing that happened in the 60s and 70s once New York started going bankrupt. The government here started saying, well, let's cut the arts programs. And once you cut the arts programs, really, it's really something to me that's, as we say in Español, es algo fatal. It's something that's fatal, because an enlightened public is an enriched public, and one that will not stand for corruption. And now, because of the dumbing down of society today, and our youth are not exposed to this great cultural art form that is part and parcel of what we are as Americans.
What
jazz.
can we do to turn that around? What can we do to make people appreciate jazz a little more?
Well, things like what we're doing right now, discussing this. We have to talk about it more. In my personal opinion, we should have congressional hearings on jazz. It should be part and parcel of the public school system. As soon as you get to the 5th grade, social studies, etc., you should start teaching about what jazz means to this country. It's our national music. It's what unites us as Americans, North Americans, Central Americans, South Americans. And I think, what I know, as far from the Latino perspective, I think what I know, in many ways, we represent beautifully what jazz is about, because in and amongst ourselves, it could be Ecuadorian, Colombian, Argentinian, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, whatever, Panamanian. We ourselves are multicultural. That's part and parcel of our history.
We have our own melting pot.
Exactly, and that's what jazz best represents. And it represents two things. When somebody asked me the other day, what does jazz represent? I said, two things, man. Freedom and the truth. As I said in Armenia, we were just in Armenia, and we talked, they asked me that.
Okay. Let's take another break, and when we come back, Bobby Sanabria will be on the drums. Stay tuned.